Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear us?
Yes, I can hear you, Mr. Griffin.
All right, good. Ms. Muller?
Yes.
The
Okay.
floor is yours.
I just saw a notification in the chat, so yeah. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Good evening to everyone that's on the Zoom call. Good evening if you are participating by phone or if you are tuned into the Facebook Live. I appreciate you for being here with us tonight. I am Kiva Muller, Communications Manager here at the Virgin Islands Housing Finance Authority, and tonight we will be talking to you about the Community Development Block Grant Mitigation Action Plan draft that we came up with and we will be submitting to HUD early January 2021. So before I bring on Director Griffith for opening remarks, we have 4 presenters today, including myself. We also have Mr. David Martin, our Chief Disaster Recovery Officer, Ms. Antoinette Fleming, Community Development Block Grant DR Director, and Mr. Neil Ratcliffe, Tetra Tech Senior Vice President. And before I go on here, I'll have Director Griffith bring some opening remarks. Director Griffith?
Thank you, Ms. Muller. Good evening to everyone. Just like to thank you for coming on board to listen to the CDBG Mitigation Action Plan, and CDBG stands for Community Development Block Grant Mitigation. This is a $774 million grant that's made available to the Virgin Islands by Congress. There are many steps that we have to go through before we actually get access to the dollars. The first being creating an action plan, getting input from the public to make sure that this document actually addresses the needs of our community. And then from there, submitting it to HUD for approval. And after HUD approves the document, then we wait for the grant signing, which actually gives the territory access to the funds. Today, you're gonna hear a lot about what separates the mitigation grant from the disaster recovery grant. You're going to also hear about what exactly mitigation means and how it can help the Virgin Islands, and what it can be, what we can use the funds for to protect us from natural and other disasters in the future. We ask for your attention. We ask for your questions. We ask for your input, because at the end of the day, this action plan is not the Housing Finance Authority's action plan. It is the action plan of the territory of the Virgin Islands. So thank you for tuning in tonight, and I turn it back to you, Ms. Muller.
Thank you, thank you. So first off, I want to say that the Mitigation Action Plan, which we'll be talking to you about today, it is actually published on our website. So if you go on to cdbgdr.vihfa.gov, what you're seeing on the right-hand corner of the screen, that's what you will click, learn more, and the draft is there. In addition, there is a press release that was sent out, and this presentation that you are viewing tonight, if you want to follow along on your own terms, you can go on the website and access it. So it is published on the website, and the public comment period will end on December 22nd. So if you have comments and you want to review the action plan on your own, if you haven't done so already, or just go back over the PowerPoint presentation, you can do so and still have time to submit your comments. So it's not limited to this forum here tonight. And I'd also like to announce that we have our second public hearing next week, Thursday, same time. So spread the word that we will be doing the same thing next week, and still looking forward to your comments. And then at a later date, sometime in early December, we will have the third installment, but that date has not been identified yet. So the goals for today's public hearing: one, we definitely want to gather feedback and comments about the Mitigation Action Plan. That is our number one goal here. because it directly affects you guys, the residents here in the Virgin Islands. So we want to make sure that you have a good say so in what we plan to do with mitigation funds. We'll also be discussing planned project areas that will help save lives and reduce future losses to homes, businesses, and critical facilities. And I'd like to highlight that DR funds is reactive, so there's a storm and you want to fix things, and mitigation funds are proactive. So we want to hear how we can better prepare for impending disasters, because we live in an area where we know there will be another hurricane. We may anticipate a tsunami, an earthquake, but we want to be very well prepared, and that's what we are doing here with mitigation. And then we want to spread the word about the comment process. We have a survey available online so that we can encourage feedback from the residents. So here is a brief graphic on what mitigation is, and this will also be sent out. This will be posted on Facebook. But the action plan overview and what the program is, and the five funding areas, and the percentages of which we will allocate monies. So today we encourage verbal comments at the end of the presentation, or you can drop your questions, comments, or concerns in the Zoom chat feature. You can also take the survey. It is also on the mitigation landing page on our website, or you can email your comments at mitigation@vihfa.gov. So there's a lot of ways where you can provide your comments and feedback. So the public input process for comments here tonight, like I said, verbal comments are encouraged. So what we would like for you to do is, if you use a chat feature, put your first name, your last name, if you are associated with any agency or organization, and then you can type your question. We will read it aloud, or if you prefer to verbally state it, you will have 4 minutes to do so. Like I said, you can also submit your comments if you do not feel comfortable doing it at this forum right now to mitigation@vihfa.gov. And I will hand it over to Mr. Martin to talk about the MIT funding.
Thank you, Kiva. Again, HUD has allocated over $774 million to the U.S. Virgin Islands due to Hurricanes Maria and Irma for mitigation and resilience. And in addition, on this slide, the action plan for mitigation has been extended to January 4th due to COVID. Thank you. You probably hear a lot about tranches, and just briefly, a tranche is essentially just a funding allocation released by HUD to provide community development block grants for disaster recovery. And today we are focused on tranche 3 for mitigation. By definition, mitigation are those activities that increase resilience to disasters and reduce or eliminate the long-term risk of loss of life, injury, damage to, and loss of property, and suffering and hardship by lessening the impact of future disasters. Mitigation is a new HUD program that has different requirements, and the goals for the CDBG mitigation, I'm on that next slide, please. Thank you. The goals for CDBG MIT are to support data-informed investments and focus on repetitive loss of property and critical infrastructure. 2, focus on building capacity to comprehensively analyze disaster risk and update hazard mitigation plans, I'm sorry. 3, to support the adoption of policies that reflect the local and regional priorities, again, with a focus on community risk reduction. And then finally, to maximize the impact of funds by leveraging private public partnerships and the coordination with other federal funding sources. And essentially, the CDGB MIT fund spending timeline is 12 years, so well into the 2030s. So now I'd like to transition to Director Fleming, who can go into more detail about CDG MIT activities. Antoinette?
Yes, thank you very much. So as he said, my role is going to talk about the mitigation requirements. So whenever with this program fund and mitigation activity, we're going to be looking at 4 main requirements. First of all, the definition, which you heard earlier from Mr. Martin. Any activity that we fund must meet the definition of a mitigation activity. The second thing we're going to be looking at when we fund a mitigation activity is it must address the current and future risk identified in the MIT needs assessment. And you hear more about that later on in our conversation. The third thing we're going to be looking at is the eligibility of the activity and the eligibility of the pursuant to the waivers or alternate requirements if it's applicable to that particular activity. The fourth thing we're going to be looking at when we fund a mitigation activity, we're going to be looking for that the project meet HUD national objectives. So when we talk about mitigation needs assessment, it is the risk-based assessment includes within the action plan that is posted on our website. It informs us about the MIT funds to meeting the mitigation needs. It's considering the identified current and future risk in disaster risk, current and future disaster risk. Sorry about that, got confused for a minute. So in the VHFA process, we use, when we're looking at the mitigation needs assessment, we did 3 things. We consult with our private sector partners. We talk to our public sector partners, government agencies. We also examined the most recent risk assessment via the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Plan. And we also identified risk in the FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan. And all these three things together is what we developed a mitigation needs assessment. So when we did the survey, and it's still going on right now, on the next slide, it shows what the rankings were. For the mitigation needs assessment, we're going to call it M&A, the section in the CDBG MIT action plan. The hazards were ranked by the potential dollar loss as it reflects in the table, which is shown on the screen. Now, this ranking arose from the careful analysis of the currently available data and is based on the identified hazards. So hurricane, as you can all well see, hurricane and riverine flooding are the top ranking hazards in the new results. Note that the riverine flooding results from heavy rainfall causing water runoff that spills into the adjacent low-lying areas, especially in the St. Thomas district and the St. John district, where we have a lot of hilly areas. Water runs off, whenever it rains, water runs from the high areas down into the low-lying areas. This riverine flooding is different from the coastal flooding, which is considered a separate risk category. The mitigation risk analysis, in a needs assessment, the section we're developing using the data from the 2019 Territorial Hazard Mitigation Plan. And here are some bullet points that I want you to be aware of. So as a result of the ongoing pandemic, the pandemic, we had to, do some additional outreach and additional information, saw some additional information to support the basis. With the mitigation risk analysis, potential risks and threats have been analyzed, existing mitigation measures that may reduce potential risk to residents in the territory. Another one of the risk analysis looked at the investment of the priorities, project selections, and the proposed program alignment with the mitigation needs assessment with the selected activities, which are outlined in the action plan. Now, significant overlap exists between the territorial priorities, the assessment of the data of the community needs, and the CDBG eligible activities, especially when we factor in the community's lifeline that are key priorities following any disaster. And as it relates to the lifelines, which can be seen in the next slide, the lifelines, you've heard these before. We're looking at safety and security. We're looking at food, water, and shelter. We're looking at how health and medical impact us during a disaster. We're looking at energy, communication, or the lack thereof of communication. We're looking at transportation, how we are impacted after the disaster, and also hazardous material. So those are the main lifelines that we are like critical service areas. Also in the MID project, I mentioned the national objective. So all CDBG MID-funded projects must demonstrate the ability to operate for the useful life of the project and include a plan for the long-term operation and maintenance of infrastructure and public facility projects. The project must be consistent with other mitigation activities that will be carried out. And we also part of the national objective, low to moderate income individual type national objective projects are very important to us. So under HUD is looking that for the benefit of the vulnerable population, the lower income people in our communities, at least 50% of our of the funds must benefit those individuals. Some of the MID funding can go to address what we call urgent need type of activities. We address these as the current and future risks identified in the MID needs assessment. And the results are measurable and verifiable reduction in risk or loss of life and property. So where we have national objectives, we also like national objectives tell us what are eligible activities. I will go on to tell you about what is not eligible or ineligible activities. Funding for a building used for the general conduct of government, emergency response services, assistance to private utilities, and the electrical power grid projects, which is covered in a future allocation. You heard some Mr. Martin speaking about the tranches, and our last tranche, which we are expecting to get from HUD, seeks to provide funding for the electrical grid. Going on to the next slide. Okay, so we're gonna repeat this information to you again because we really want the public to go onto the website, and the website address is shown here, https://cdbgdr.vihfa.gov/. When you go on that site, on the right-hand side, as you have heard from Kiva, there's gonna be CDBG Mitigation Action Plan Draft. Click on the button that says Learn More, or if you go on the site, you will see there's an individual tab that says CDBG Mitigation, actually says Mitigation. If you click on that, again, you will get the same information, giving you information, general information on mitigation, as well as the action plan. So at this point in time, I'm going to turn the conversation over to Mr. Neil Radcliffe, and he's going to talk about the proposed activities. And this information can be found more heavily and more detailed in the action plan. Neil, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, great.
Good job. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you and to talk more about the CDBG mitigation program. Some of the activities that we've identified are in broad categories: infrastructure and public facilities, housing, economic revitalization, planning, and public services. Next slide. And there are a lot of considerations that we have to take into to put into the equation, if you will, in determining how to use this funding. First, we look at does the project benefit the low and moderate income population? The Housing and Community Development Act, upon which the CDBG, DR, and mitigation programs is based, has a primary purpose for protecting and helping people of low and moderate income. And so that's always going to be a major focal point with any CDBG program. And then we look at what kind of hazards will the project mitigate and how will it mitigate against them? What kind of impact will that have on the community lifelines that were referenced earlier? And then generally, does the benefit outweigh the cost over the life of the project? HUD will look very closely also at implementation to see if the recipient of the funding has the capacity to implement the project. And sustainability is really important too. We need to be able to see, and HUD needs to see, that there's funding required for long-term maintenance and carrying out and maintaining the project over its useful life. Next slide. So in assessing mitigation risks, this particular analytical exercise was, I think, very instructive. We mentioned earlier that the major risks that the mitigation analysis told us that we should focus on are, not surprisingly, the number one risk is hurricanes. So if you look at this table here, you can see that this projects the total amount of losses from a hurricane. Obviously, these are estimates. And you can see that for hurricanes, the total estimated loss for all three islands would be about $6.5 billion. Coastal flooding would be about $409,000. And that's because of the way the shelf on the island is configured. Coastal flooding is not as big a problem in the Virgin Islands as it is in places like Houston, Texas, where I'm from, where the shelf out in front of the Houston area is very flat, and it allows for a tremendous amount of upsurge into the rivers and flooding from the coast. Riverine flooding, as Antoinette mentioned earlier, is the number two risk in terms of particularly dangerous hazards here. And you can see that an estimated total loss from riverine flooding could be up to $2.1 billion. And then an important part of this analysis to look at is the return period. So the riverine flooding is projected to occur, once every 100 years. Hurricane flooding, or hurricane damage rather, is projected to return on a 50-year basis. So there are some kinds of hazards out there, like earthquakes, for example, that if one that was significant hit the Virgin Islands, the total loss, estimated at $12 billion, could be more than you would see from a hurricane. However, the return period for earthquakes is 1,000 years versus 50 years for a hurricane. Similarly, with tsunamis, you could have a lot of loss from a tsunami, but the return periods there is calculated at 500 years. And so the two biggest sources of two biggest hazards that we're facing here end up being hurricane and riverine flooding because of their relative frequency and the high amount of damage that they could inflict. Next slide, please. These are the different activity categories and an indication of how much money is being proposed to be allocated to each of them. So for infrastructure and public facilities, we have $102,500,000 for community resilience and public facilities projects, $315,700,000 for resilient, critical, and natural infrastructure projects, for a total of infrastructure and public facilities of $418,200,000, which represents 54% of the total funding. And for economic resilience and revitalization programs, there are two categories that HUD has carved out there. One is for commercial hardening and financing, which we have slated about $41 million, and for small business mitigation, approximately $36 million. So the total allocation is almost $77 million, and that's 10% of the allocation. For housing, for multifamily, we're looking at $102,500,000 allocated, and for a Virgin Islands Housing Finance Authority new home construction program that would focus on home ownership for people who are at levels of moderate income, 61,500,000 has been set aside. We've also established in the plan 23 million, almost 24 million to promote homeless housing initiatives that particularly focus on permanent supportive housing. And then there's an innovative, resilient housing program that could be put into place to help folks temporarily after disasters. 5.1 million is slated for that. So 192 million, almost 193 million in total for housing. And it's important to note that these are the allocations that seem to make the most sense given the amount of feedback that we've received from residents, government officials, nonprofit organizations, for-profit entities and organizations. We've spent a lot of time gathering public input to try to find consensus on what items are the most important for us to focus on. And so that's what this list reflects. But that doesn't mean that these allocation amounts can't change. So the purpose for us putting out the draft action plan on the internet is to give members of the public the opportunity to look at this material, digest it, and then comment and tell us if maybe you think that less should be spent on infrastructure and public facilities and more should go into housing, for example. These aren't etched in stone. Public services, which are things such as funding for nonprofits that provide social services. We've got 15.4 million, 32.4 million for planning. So there's a lot of good planning work that could be done there. HUD allocates 5% of the funds for administration. So this is what the Virgin Islands Housing Finance Authority uses to implement this $774 million program. Next slide. So we've talked about the infrastructure and public facilities a bit. Those are things that could be, permanent emergency shelters, community centers that serve as shelters. In HUD language, public facilities means structures that are owned by public entities. And so that can really run a wide range of different types of facilities. And so we've got 102 million in community resilient and public facilities and 315 million in resilient critical and natural infrastructure. Next slide, please. This is, I'm not going to read this whole slide, but we're trying to give you a bit of a flavor of some of the material that's in the draft action plan on the internet. Looking at critical infrastructure resilience, part of what we focused on is that hardening public infrastructure is really critical to the territory's ability to mitigate risks. And this kind of funding would be focused on activities that mitigate risk to utilities, transportation, hazardous waste disposal, and other systems that serve the health and safety of the community. One big concern that I think everybody in the USDI has is regarding sustainable waste. As most of you know, the waste disposal facilities have been massively overburdened with the disasters that have occurred. And so there is funding here to help with that. Next slide, please. This is a little bit more detail about infrastructure project examples. So the Department of Public Works has identified various mechanisms to reduce overall vulnerability of the transportation infrastructure. Things of this nature could include repair, reconstruction, and improvement to transportation infrastructure, including roads, bridges, guts, culverts, additional drainage systems, embankments, traffic signals, etc. Those are the structural kinds of things that could be done. You can also do non-structural projects, which could include hydrologic and hydraulic studies, flood risk modeling, monitoring systems such as GIS, public outreach, etc. Next slide, please. Policies and procedures will be developed for determining which of these infrastructure projects should be undertaken. And then those entities, departments of the territorial government, et cetera, that desire to have programs funded will need to submit an application that describes, in particular, the project's connection to the specific hazard mitigation needs that are relevant for that project. Next slide, please. Covered projects is a special category HUD has identified when you have a project where the total cost is $50 million or more, and at least 25 million of that total cost is CDBG funds, then it's called a covered project. And those covered projects have additional requirements, including the development of a fairly technical benefit cost analysis along the lines of what FEMA requires for funding in its programs. So that's something there are no covered projects specifically identified in the draft action plan now. If it turns out that some of the projects that are proposed are more than $50 million, then we could go back and amend the action plan to accommodate that. Next slide, please. Economic revitalization, talked about a bit earlier. This one sometimes is a little bit hard for people to kind of wrap their heads around. The HUD guidelines allowed for economic revitalization to be spent for commercial hardening and financing. So that could be something like, flood proofing a business. It could be, improving drainage systems on private property that is commercial property to mitigate the possibility of floods impacting that business. It could be doing things such as improving port capacity to be able to allow more goods and people to come in and out effectively in terms of those that affect the businesses on the island. Small business mitigation is pretty, is what it sounds like. If you've got a small business that's been damaged from the hurricane and there are ways that you could see to be able to take measures to make that business more resilient before the next disaster strikes, God forbid, then you can be eligible for that source of funding. So these two categories are pretty broad, and this is much more funding than has been allocated to economic resilience and revitalization in the past. Next slide, please. So these are allocations. Again, I won't spend too much time on this. This slide just shows you what community lifelines are impacted by these different programs. And as you can see, there's a theme that's emerging here that all of these projects have to be things that help to reduce the danger to human life and that make people safer and that reduce the risk of loss to businesses and homes. Next slide, please. So one of the goals of the commercial hardening and financing program is to minimize operational downtime and accelerate recovery of commercial areas after a disaster. As I mentioned before, those could be privately owned commercial or industrial buildings or ports that could be rehabilitated or hardened to become more resilient. Next slide, please. This gives a little bit more information about small business mitigation, some of the kinds of things that could be more specifically used there. It would be important to focus on small businesses that create jobs predominantly for people who are low and moderate income, things that would help to grow the tourism industry through key infrastructure improvements to ports and commercial areas, increasing the territory's capacity to receive tourists and provide jobs could be very, very important. Hardening infrastructure to mitigate against future disasters in key commercial areas would be key there as well. Next slide, please. In the housing category, there's about almost $103 million dedicated to multifamily housing, about $62 million dedicated to home ownership, new home ownership, and $23 million for homeless and housing initiatives, and a little over $5 million for innovative resilient housing, that, as we discussed a little bit earlier. Some of these we're purposely engaging in a little bit of repetition because these are typically the kind of points that folks most want to know about. You know, it's when all is said and done, where is the money going, and what projects and kinds of activities will benefit from it. So we're trying to drive that home and encourage y'all to look at the draft action plan and focus on those areas. Next slide, please. This indicates some of the community lifelines impacted by the housing programs. Let's see, the new home construction program, that's something that we heard a lot of feedback regarding the fact that single family homes are so expensive in the US Virgin Islands, and home ownership has historically been something that is very, very much prized by residents of the US Virgin Islands. And so this program would allow for the development of new homes that could be offered to people for purchase, and not just, most of the HUD programs that benefit people of low and moderate income are for people at 80% of area median income and below. This program could go up to 120% of area median income, and could be a great way to help a lot of folks get into houses that otherwise would have a difficult time doing so. Next slide, please. Public services, as I mentioned earlier, those are social services generally that can be funded with CDBG MIT money, and can be used to do all kinds of things that are very beneficial, from mental health counseling to, you know, medical care to employment services, reentry programs, etc. So that funding can be used quite creatively to do some really great things that can start helping people quite quickly. You know, it takes a long time to build a new road or major highway, but it doesn't take near as long to grant money to nonprofits that are already there doing good work on the USVI to be able to do more of what they're already doing. And planning presents a huge opportunity to look at elements of disaster recovery and mitigation that just folks haven't had the money to analyze before. So that's something that provides a huge opportunity. Next slide, please. This just talks about the community lifelines that the planning activities impact. Next slide. Next slide, please. My computer might just be slow. Okay, great. This reiterates that public services can be used to propose new services or provide a measurable increase in an existing operational service. Next slide, please. We already talked about administration and the amount there, and the total amount of funding are $774,188,000. Next slide, please. People often wonder, why it costs, say, $38 million to administer a program of this nature. But when you think about it, it's a $750 million project, and 5% operating costs is actually a lot less than what community development block grant program funds usually allow, which is up to 20%. So this is a much smaller number than normal. That I can tell you, having worked on several of these projects and overseeing them throughout the country, that it takes a lot of good people to run these programs, and so this amount of money is actually a pretty conservative amount. Next slide, please. We've gone over the timeline that's illustrated here and in other presentations, and you can see that we have put the application plan on the website and making it available for comment for 45 days. And right now we're in the process of responding to and incorporating comments. So the action plan will be submitted after we get these responses back in and make changes to the plan that are deemed appropriate. Then we submit it to HUD by January 4th of 2021. And then they have a relatively short time frame within which to decide to approve the plan. If they have questions or comments, they can send it back to us and ask us to go back to the drawing board on some issues. But we will communicate closely with HUD as we go through that process to do everything we can to minimize the amount of time it takes to get the action plan approved. Because once the action plan is approved, then HUD will generate a grant agreement with the U.S. Virgin Islands, and that's necessary to actually be able to turn on the spigot, so to speak, and start having funding flowing to projects. Next slide, please. And this is just another recap of where all the funding's going. Next slide, please. I will turn the time.
I think that's me. Thank you so much, Neil.
You're welcome.
And all right. Is my camera on all right? Okay. So we have ongoing stakeholder input. Like I mentioned before, this is the first public hearing and is conducted to receive comments and feedback after the action plan has been published. Some of you guys have probably been with us on this journey since over the summer, where we did 3 public hearings to get your input before the action plan was drafted, and we promised that we would come back after it's drafted to let you know what we came up with and what do you think about it. So here we are, and this comment period is open for 45 days, like Neil said, and it will close on December 22nd. It's going to give us some time to incorporate all of your comments and feedback, and then we will submit it to HUD on January 4th. This again is a little infographic about the program areas for proposed funding. We're going to get into verbal comments in a second. Like I said before, if you do have questions and comments, you can use the chat feature here on Zoom. I'd like you to state your name and if you are representing an organization, and then state your question. Also would like you to take the mitigation survey that's listed on our website. And if you need some more time to read through the action plan or go over the presentation, you can also email your comments to mitigation@vihfa.gov. And we'll be receiving those until December 22nd. What we would like to hear from you is, what do you think about how we divided the allotment for the 5 areas? You can share your ideas on projects that you'd like to see funded, and just what you think about our mitigation plan. So at this time, we will entertain comments, and I saw some notifications up in the chat room. Okay.
Sorry, Kiva, that was me. I was letting everyone know that
I'm reading it now.
that the plan is also available in Spanish for those who are interested. And I also provided the email address if you want to send your comments via email. It's mitigation@vihfa.gov.
Thanks, Antoine, and thank you for mentioning that it isn't located. It is available in Spanish. So when you go on the website, there's 4 documents under the Mitigation Action Plan tab. It's the action plan, the full document in English, full document in Spanish. It's also a press release about the public hearings, this one today and the one scheduled for next week, and the Zoom information. And also this presentation that you are following along. And I anticipate that most of you will not read the entire action plan, even though I would really love you to. It's great information in there. So this presentation is also on the website, a scaled down version or just a synthesized version of what is in the action plan. So you can use either or you can use a presentation and then refer back to the action plan and then submit your comments. So at this time, I'm going to entertain some questions. I do not mind if you unmute yourself and go ahead and ask if you want to do it verbally. If not, you can place your comments in the chat room. If you do it verbally, of course, state your name for the record and the organization you represent, and you can go right ahead with your comments. Brenna, you're on the line. I think you're going to do our timekeeping, 4 minutes per person. And I open the floor to comments and feedback. So the first one I see in the chat room, I'll read it out loud. It's from Barbara Walsh, and she is representing the VI Trail Alliance. Barbara asks, when and how would specific projects be submitted from nonprofit groups? Or can we submit general ideas that we would like to see implemented? Thank you for that question, Barbara. I'll repeat it. When and how would specific projects be submitted from nonprofit groups? Or can we submit general ideas that we would like to see implemented? Who would like to take that question? Anyone?
Sorry about that. I was trying to get off of mute. I am so sorry. I could take the initial stab and allow anyone else to chime in afterwards. Okay. But the first question is, when and how would specific projects be submitted from nonprofits? There are several instances within the action plan where we allow nonprofits to apply for to do different projects. As you read the action plan, you will see different things about a request for proposal for different activities within the plan. And the other question that you asked, can we submit general ideas that we would like to see implemented? Yes, please do, by the comments in the mitigation@vihfa.gov email address. Through this chat, we want to hear some of your general ideas, or even through any other media source that you would like to engage us with. But Neil's on the line, and I'm sure Neil can add more information to that too as well.
Oh, no, that was great. I just wanted to also point out the fact that with the over $30 million of planning funding that's available, that kind of money could be used to look at pedestrian, bicycle, other kinds of mobility improvements and plans for the islands. So there's a lot that can be done here between the planning funding and then looking at the infrastructure funding. It's not hard to make a good argument to HUD that increasing pedestrian mobility will improve safety in the event of a disaster, right? There's a lot that the Trails Alliance could do, and that we hope that you will avail yourselves of with this funding.
Barbara, let us know if that answers your question.
Yes, if I could just speak up for a minute.
Sure.
Then. So how specifically do we go ahead and apply, or is that all spelled out in the action plan?
I can take that one. The application process isn't all spelled out in detail in the action plan. The action plan lays out the basic programs and activities and categories of funding and the mitigation needs assessment, et cetera. But specific policies and procedures will be written to actually implement each of these plans. So there will be, in the case of say, nonprofit organizations that are wanting to apply for some of this funding, there would be a procurement done according to federal procurement rules, because we're dealing with federal money. That would be put out an RFP or something of that nature. That would be put out on the street so that you would know what kind of funding is available and what the requirements are specifically to apply for that funding. We don't have all of those specifics completely nailed down right now, but that will be available to you.
Okay, thank you so much. So as I understand it, right now we're looking at sort of the big picture and trying to divide up the funding in the different areas that we think are the most important.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Okay, great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I just don't know.
Kiva, it looks like there's a new question about when.
Yeah, I see that. D. Douglas asked, when do you expect to have the specifics for nonprofit RFPs? When do you expect to have the specifics for nonprofit RFPs? Mr. Douglas, I need you to explain a little bit more. What do you mean by that?
So it's Demetria, I'm Mrs.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
So it's a follow-up to the question that Ms. Walsh asked. So I'm working for a nonprofit, and we have some projects that we feel like would fall under some of this funding. And so I'm wondering what that timeline looks like for us. Like, when would the request for proposal information, how to apply, what gets covered, when would that be available for the nonprofit sector?
And unmute. Yeah, I muted myself. I can take that one if you'd like, Kiva. The way the timing is working is that we've got to submit the revised action plan after we get y'all's comments by January 4th. And then HUD has, I believe, 60 days to be able to review the action plan for approval or ask us to modify it. And then after that, it typically takes them a few months to get your actual grant agreement in place. So that's going to put you out to January, February, March, probably April, right? And once the Virgin Islands Housing Finance Authority knows that HUD has approved the action plan, then they will likely parallel track development of the policies and procedures for the different programs alongside the time frame that HUD is working on the grant agreement. And then once they get a grant agreement in place, then RFPs would go out after that. So we just don't have an exact timeline for you, but it would be, probably in the April, May, June timeframe, depending on the number of folks we have to focus on all these procedures and programs. One of the things that we hope people will recognize is that the Virgin Islands Housing Finance Authority just normally has a fraction of the amount of funding that has been distributed or allocated through disaster recovery and through mitigation. And so, we're having to come up with brand new programs that are massively bigger than anything we've ever remotely done before. So we'll get that done as quickly as we can, but just ask for your patience, and maybe Mr. Griffith can provide some shed some light on that.
I'd like to also level set expectations too as well, because from the last grant that we received, the action plan, that the action plan was approved, HUD gave us a grant agreement 11 months after. So if that's the case, that we get approval during the time frame that Mr. Radcliffe envisions, it might be close to another year before we get the grant agreement. The authority and the governor of the Virgin Islands will be pushing aggressively with HUD to increase that timeline. But that was the timeline on the last grant agreement that we received.
And thank you for the clarification, Mr. Griffith. And, you know, some jurisdictions that have received this funding have decided that once they've got their action plan approved, if it's taking HUD a long time to get their grant agreement done, they will sometimes do procurements for some of the programs and just condition any awards on not happening until the grant agreement is in place. So you can kind of parallel track things and speed up the timeline that way. Really, we're looking for every way possible to speed up the timeline, but Mr. Griffith is absolutely right. We don't want to inflate expectations and cause people to think that this is all going to happen, you know, in 2 or 3 months, when it's likely to take significantly more than that.
Neil, if I may add, and Mr. Griffith, just one more comment related to this. I think you've explained it well, that that this is longer term recovery and mitigation, so they do take a while. But in the draft of the action plan, if you're interested in more specifics, you can also see eligible entities listed in these programs, including nonprofits, kind of to see which programs might apply to nonprofits once an application is available. And there is a general time frame provided for each of the programs that's dependent upon signing the grant agreement with HUD. That's kind of when the timeline would begin, but there's a frame of reference there that might be helpful.
Thanks, Brenna.
Okay, another question here from Jason Budsman. Hazard mitigation materials were mentioned as a category. Has an agency such as the Waste Management Authority shown interest in funding for a project, or Public Works? So hazard mitigation materials were mentioned as a category, and has an agency, for example, Waste Management or Public Works, shown interest in funding for a project? This is a good one that we have an answer to. Does anyone want to take that?
So, Kiva, this is Antoinette. Yes, the CDBG mitigation funds will be heavily impacted with infrastructure type activities, such as what Mr. Jason has been mentioning. So yes, we have been speaking to Public Works, Waste Management Authority, and we have gotten a lot of the information from their needs assessment that impacted our results too as well. Kiva, you want to move on to the next question from
Yeah, I was struggling to unmute my mic. So Miguel Quinones, he's a resident. He asked or stated, DPNR has stated that they are relying on CDBG MIT process, the CDBG MIT process, to support the update of their land and water use plan, including the drafting of the scope of work and funding. Can residents contribute and review the scope of work to ensure that it addresses the needs of the community and promotes construction methods that better address stormwater management, gray water reuse, and on-site renewable energy? That was a mouthful, so I'm going to read it again. Okay. DPNR has stated that they are relying on a CDBG MIT process to support and update their land and water use plan, including the drafting of the scope of work and funding. Can residents contribute and review the scope to ensure that it addresses the needs of the community and promotes construction methods that better address stormwater management, gray water reuse, and on-site renewable energy generation?
Kiva, I could this is Brenna from Tetra Tech. I could briefly address this just from a planning perspective. I have a background in planning, but typically in a planning process, there would be public input gathered as part of that process early on. And so I think the short answer to your question is yes, residents should and would have the opportunity, if a plan for DPNR for land and water use was funded through the planning program and CDBG MIT, public input would be part of that planning process.
Miguel, does that answer your question? Thumbs up if it does.
And Kiva, I think it's important for us to sort of reemphasize too to the folks who are participating in this presentation that, you know, you don't have to pose a question per se. A big part of this public participation process is giving us the opportunity to hear your thoughts. So if you just have a comment about a particular area of mitigation or resilience that you feel strongly about, that you want to be looked at very seriously, for example, then you're very welcome to chime in and register those comments. It's not just questions, but comments and input, and all of these comments we're going to gather and we'll respond to and submit those responses to HUD. So it's an important part of this process to get on the public record thoughts, concerns, et cetera, as opposed to just questions from the general public.
Any other questions, feel free to state them. And I also wanted to mention that I know a lot of questions are coming about when can you apply for funding. So you're a little ahead of the game. So we want to get the action plan done, signed, and etched in stone. We always have opportunities to amend the action plan, but we want to get it signed first so we can have access to the funding. And then when we have access to the funding, there are some projects that are, I guess, earmarked for funding already, but most of the funding will be on an application basis, similar to DR funds. And some of the subrecipients already know the process. But there will be opportunities for NGOs, nonprofits, and other agencies to apply for funding. And when that opportunity arises, be sure or rest assured that we will advertise and reach out to any agency or organization that the funds may be eligible for, to let you know that these funds are available and you can apply. So it's not that we're gonna just do this public outreach and then when the funds are available, you won't hear from us again. We'll be communicating with you on a rolling basis as to the status of the funds, and then you guys can apply and get that process rolling. If anyone wants to briefly touch or walk through the process for a subrecipient, I would appreciate that. I should call them Antoinette, but anyone, just so they can get an idea of how to apply for funds when they become available. That might help.
Sure, I can do that.
Thank you.
On the CDBG DR funds, what we did, we developed a process flow that went like this. We will engage any entity that wants to engage with us had to go through what we call a capacity assessment. And in that capacity assessment, we looked at the entity's ability to undertake a grant. We looked at the entity's policies and procedures for grant management, financial management, and other activities, your organizational chart as well. Once we have finished doing that capacity assessment, we rate you as high or low risk. And the ranking just gives us an opportunity just to know how much we'll be able to monitor you, whether or not you're monitored very closely, very loosely, or how your ability to actually spend the funds too as well with that risk assessment. Once that capacity assessment is completed, we do what we call a subrecipient agreement with you, the entity. After that subrecipient agreement is signed and executed, we post it on our website for everyone to see. Right after that process is done, we do a DR application. Now, mitigation, that was said before, would have a different application structure, but it will be similar. Mitigation has their own set of questions that are a little different from DR. So we'll be working with the Tetra Tech team to develop that actual application process. And then we'll also have some projects that don't necessarily go through an application, but they go through a RFP process. So there's different type of processes we'll be doing under mitigation. So once we have a mitigation application completed by an entity, we usually do an environmental review with the entity to make sure the project has the project that you're proposing does not pose an impact to the environment, or the environment around your project does not pose an impact to the project. After the environmental review is done, we issue you what we call a notice to proceed. And right before that, we call a project agreement. The project agreement takes the information from your DR application or your mitigation application, especially your budget, and we put it into an agreement where Mr. Griffith and the entity signs off on, and we issue your notice to proceed. That notice to proceed allows you to spend funds, and allows you to do an RFP to hire an architect or hire a contractor for your mitigation project, sorry. And that is pretty much the steps for getting funding if you're gonna go through the application process. If it's an RFP, what we will do at VIHFA, we will put an ad in the paper, letting the public know that we are looking for a vendor, a nonprofit, or an entity, or a developer to undertake certain type of activities that's listed in the RFP. It will usually have a deadline date, and through that RFP, the vendor should submit a proposal to undertake the activity. And once the vendor is selected, we would engage into a contract with the entity, and then we would initiate the project. Okay, Kiva?
Perfect. Thank you, Antoinette. Still looking for more questions, feedback. If you guys need me to go back on any of the slides, I will do so.
This is Alma Wingfield.
Excuse me?
Yes,
Alma, go right ahead.
Alma Wingfield with VI Trail Alliance. I wanted to just say thank you for all the work that you have done to put this together. We do appreciate it. I think the categories have been very appropriate. My comment tonight is more in an overall theme that I hope that some of these projects that we do that fall under the different categories will consider. And this is about livable communities. Each of these projects, whether it be housing, whether it be hospital, port authority, road infrastructure, all of this, these projects have the ability to move people and to move people within their project area. And I really hope that they look at this from a systemic point of view of how not only people move, but how they actually can communicate to the environment around them. And I hope that these projects, we are a small environment, that they're actually being coordinated, because many of the projects end up being next to each other, like a housing project next to a road project, which may have a sidewalk element. Housing projects give real consideration to pedestrian pathways within the development. They can be mitigation tools, but as long as they are considered, putting people, the footprint first will help many low to income people. So that is my comment. Hopefully, as a community, we move towards the principles of livable communities. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Alma. I appreciate it.
And I would add to your comments that HUD is very, very pro, livable communities, new urbanism, defensible spaces, pedestrian-friendly environments. That all of those kinds of principles that you're talking about are things that I agree with you should absolutely be incorporated in the projects that are undertaken here. And that's another area where you could use some of the planning money to look at ways to make sure that the public spaces between some of these different projects are not forgotten and are taken into consideration in terms of pedestrian access and mobility and some of the other important things that you referenced.
And if people are working on projects and need some ideas about putting people first in their projects, we at VI Trail Alliance would be willing to help, and the Walkability Institute of the VI as well. Thank you.
Great. And if you have documents or things that you want to become part of the public record for recommendations, you can email them to the Housing Finance Authority, and those can be included as part of the comments.
Yes, as the part of the Walkability Institute, we have developed a document of guiding principles, so we will definitely share those with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I see another question. Okay, Barbara Walsh asked, is there any consideration for mitigating a health or environmental disaster from the lime tree refinery? That's a major one. Is there any consideration for mitigating a health or environmental disaster from the lime tree refinery?
Kiva, I'll be honest with you, I don't have a response for that. Just thinking broadly about, for the mitigation funding, health is obviously one of them as well. The lifelines, environmental disaster could also be under the hazard, which is another lifeline. But anything is possible. I would not want to say, well, no or yes, but any consideration to anything that would impact the territory, save lives during a disaster can be feasibly possible.
And this is something also to add to that, Mrs. Fleming, a company like LimeTree does have a health and safety plan, but this is definitely something that if someone like DPNR or another entity would like to apply for a plan and grant for something like that, that is something that can be considered too as well.
So the question did touch a lot of the lifelines, touch 2 lifelines right there. So we're just, anything is feasibly possible.
Any other questions? Questions from you guys on the Facebook Live? Feel free to go ahead and type those in the chat feature. While I wait for some more questions, on this slide here, I also wanted to highlight some of the key differences from disaster recovery. Although on a slide where we show the, let me see if I can find it. Oh, I'm so sorry. This slide here, even though it says DR and MIT is tranche 3, it is its own program by itself. So it's CDBG, MIT, and now I'm trying to find the other slide back here. So some of the key differences with MIT is that many of the activities do not have to have a direct tie to the 2017 storms, but they should be linked to identified risks. And like I said before, disaster recovery is more reactive and mitigation is more proactive, mitigating against future risks. Also, DR, those funds have to be spent 6 years from the signed action plan agreement, whereas mitigation, 50% of the funds should be spent by the 6-year mark and 100% by 12 years. So this is definitely not a sprint. This is a long distance run, and we will be here for quite some time, making sure that we rebuild stronger and more resilient. Also, mitigation activities are not limited to hurricane recovery efforts alone, but it should just pretty much help the territory better prepare for future disasters. As you heard before, on that one slide where they ranked the hazards, there's riverine flooding, earthquakes, tsunamis, anything that poses a risk to the territory. So I just wanted to highlight the key differences from DR and MIT.
Kiva, one of the questions that came on to my computer, someone wants to know if you can make that slide a little bigger on their screen.
This one, I really can't. But what I will do is drop the file. Maybe that person wants to see the graphic here. If that's the case, I'll drop the file
on our website.
I haven't posted it to the website yet, but I will drop it in the comments.
You could also put it on the website so everyone can see it.
Oh yeah, I will.
Thank you.
I definitely will do that.
Yeah. Just a suggestion, if we have no other comments or questions, maybe we can bring on Mr. Griffith to make the closing remarks.
Yes. 1 second there.
He's here.
I just want to say thank you to the VIHFA team, my CDBG team, my CDBG MIT team for putting this presentation together. The Tetra Tech team as well. You guys did a great job. And this is a lot of valuable information. To the listening public, I'd ask you to share this slide, this information that you're receiving. It's going to be on our website, vihfa.gov. It's also going to be on Facebook. So when you go on Facebook, please like it and share it so that as many people in the community as possible can see it and take advantage of it. This is an exciting grant in terms of what Ms. Muller said, that it's a grant that's looking forward, that looks to protect us from future disasters. We're going to be doing a number of requests for proposals with this grant, a little bit different than what we did for disaster recovery. So almost all of the homelessness initiatives, which is a little bit over $23 million, we're going to put RFPs out for nonprofits can apply and help really put a dent in the homeless problem in the territory. So I ask you to start thinking from now. A year from now might seem like a long time, but it'll come before you blink. And would love you to come with great ideas, great programs, so that we can really put a dent in the homeless problem in the Virgin Islands. We finally have the ability to do that. And for the walkability, the trails, that's very close to my heart and close to everyone here who lives in the Virgin Islands. We're going to be looking for a lot of great ideas. And also we're going to put in out RFPs for that too as well, for land that's owned by the authority that would like your help to create things from walking trails, bike trails, pools for people to be able to use. So everything and anything is on the table that's going to help to mitigate the Virgin Islands from future disasters and make our community a better place to live. Thank you for your attention tonight. God bless you guys and have a great night. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.